friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and we are back with week 4 in the 2024 Every Bit Counts Challenge. This is the food preservation challenge that we do every August, both here on YouTube and on Instagram. The goal of the challenge is to preserve something every day of the month, and I document my projects that I'm doing here for you in these weekly videos. I've also been sharing them in stories on Instagram, so you can see some of the work that I accomplished this week behind me, as well as there are some things that are in the freezer. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how I got all of these things in jars. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, we're going to start with these cabbages. Now, cabbage is a vegetable that you don't necessarily have to do anything to preserve it. If this were cabbage that had been harvested in the fall, I would simply put it straight down into the root cellar where it's nice and cool, and that cabbage would just store down there. Or I could put it in an overflow fridge if I didn't have a root cellar, and it would just keep there in its raw form, and whenever I wanted cabbage, I could just grab some. Since it's earlier in the year, I'm going to go ahead and preserve this in a different method, and then we will save the fall harvest of cabbage to use raw in cold storage. So there are many things that I could do to preserve this. I could shred it up and ferment it into sauerkraut, and I will take some cabbage later this year and probably do that. But for this particular batch of cabbage, I'm just chopping it up into wedges like this, and we're going to blanch it and freeze it. I have a favorite meal is sauteed cabbage and some bacon grease. And so if I get it all pre-cut and shredded in the freezer, it'll just make for really easy side dishes later on in the year. So blanching is a process of boiling and then shocking with cold water instantly. This stops the enzyme action in the cabbage and preserves the nutrition of the vegetable. For cabbage, you need to boil it for 3 minutes before you shock it with that cold water. I know a lot of people don't blanch their vegetables and they just freeze them raw, and you can do that, but those unblanched vegetables start to lose their nutrients in the freezer after about 3 months. Versus if you blanch your vegetables, they won't begin to lose nutrients in the freezer for up to a year. So it really is an important process for preserving the nutrition. Some vegetables do well if you don't blanch them in terms of texture. Some vegetables really do need to be blanched so that they have a better texture when they thaw and come out of the freezer. So it is a personal preference thing. If you don't blanch, it's not going to make your vegetables unsafe in the freezer, but it just is going to affect the nutrients that you are getting out of that frozen food. And so if you want to get the optimal nutrition from your frozen veggies, take the extra time to blanch them first. So I took those wedges of cabbage and I'm chopping them up the way that I like to have them for a side dish of sauteed vegetables. It's really important that you get all of the excess moisture out of your frozen food before you begin to bag it up. That's also going to really help you preserve the texture of that food. You don't want to have an ice buildup in the freezer on those veggies. And while you can just simply toss the cabbage into like a gallon Ziploc freezer bag and put it in the freezer, vacuum sealing is just another step to help preserve that vegetable and preserve the texture as best as possible. This is going to prevent freezer burn, and I just find that you have a better product in the end when you take the time to vacuum seal the vegetables. So that's what we're doing here. And after we got all of those bags, all of the excess oxygen pulled out of them and got them heat sealed, we had, I believe, 7 bags of cabbage here. That'll make for 7 easy side dishes. The kids can just toss these into a pan with some bacon grease, maybe chop up an onion, and they can help me with meals really easily this way. So this was just purely about convenience. Now on to the next day's project. I have a lot of garlic in storage to deal with. I decided I want to pickle just a tiny small batch. And what usually prevents me from doing projects like this with garlic is that I really do not like to peel garlic. It's just one of those tedious tasks that I really dislike. So I'm trying a new method here. I was told that if you soak your garlic in warm water, that those peels will come right off. So that's what we're going to do. While I'm letting those soak for a little bit, I'm gathering all of the ingredients that I'm going to need to make the brine for my pickled garlic. So I'm starting with 2 cups of distilled white vinegar. And to that, I'm going to add a half a cup of honey. You could use whatever sweetener you like. If you want to use sugar, that would work too. I just chose to use honey on this day. If you want to completely omit the sweetener, you could also do that. It doesn't affect the safety of the canning process. It's just there for flavor. So do whatever you want with that. Next, we are going to add our salt. And I am doing a half a teaspoon of salt here. All of these spices will not affect the safety of your product. These are just personal preference, so spice it up however you would like. I'm adding a half a teaspoon of mustard seed here. I'm going to add a quarter of a teaspoon of turmeric, and this is not for flavor. This is primarily just for color. It adds a really beautiful golden yellow color to your jars that I think looks pretty on the shelf. And then for a little bit of spice, we're going to add a fourth of a teaspoon of crushed red pepper. And that is going to make the contents of our brine for this day. I'm just going to get this stirred up really well to get that honey off of the bottom of the pot. And then I'm going to put this on the heat just to help get that honey to dissolve into the liquid before we fill our jars in a little bit. But now I'm going to get back to peeling this garlic. So I do have to say that with the soaked garlic, some of the skins on these garlic just slipped right off, super easy. Some of them were still a little bit of work, but I think that it's less work than it would have been had I not soaked them. So out of all of the different methods that have been recommended to me for making this process easier, this is probably the best one so far. This worked really well. It's not perfect. It's still a tedious task no matter what you do, but I've tried other things that people have recommended in the past, like shaking the garlic in a container to help slip the skins off, lots of other things, and this is by far the best method that has been recommended so far. So make sure you try this the next time you need to peel a bunch of garlic. What I'm doing is taking my 4 little half-pint jars and I'm filling them about 2/3 of the way with the peeled garlic. And I'm leaving some space on the top because I decided that I did want to add a little bit of onion as well. As you guys know, I have this teeny tiny onions from our harvest that I'm trying to use up in canning projects, and I thought that would add some good flavor to my pickled garlic as well. And now we're just going to add our brine to these jars, leaving a 1/2-inch headspace. You're probably wondering how I plan to use this pickled garlic, and I actually have children who love raw garlic and they love pickled foods, so I'm mostly making it for those kids who will eat these cloves raw. I can just open a jar of this and keep it in the fridge, and those kids can grab garlic whenever they want to eat it, or we can chop it up and put it on pizzas or anywhere else that you would use raw garlic. I also think that the brine of this, when we're done with the garlic, is going to make a really tasty salad dressing, so I'm excited to try that. Just this is a first year for me doing pickled garlic. I've done pickled garlic scapes before and they've turned out wonderfully, and so every year I try to try a few new things, can up a few new things that I've never done before, and this was just one of those projects. So I do want to make sure that I wipe the rims of those jars well because there is honey in that is pretty sticky. We want to make sure there's nothing that will compromise the seal. Then we're going to add our canning lids. As always, we're using 4 jars canning lids. You can get 10% off your lids if you use my code and the link in this video description. So make sure you check that out. Now, pickled items are acidic enough with the vinegar in them to be safely water bath canned. So these jars are going to process in the water bath canner for just 10 minutes. And once they're done, we're going to have some beautiful yellow jars of shelf-stable pickled garlic. So I'm really excited to try these. I will let you guys know how the kids enjoy them when we open one. Later that night, I grabbed some ham hocks out of the freezer. These are from the pigs that just came back from the butcher a few weeks ago, and I got them in my roasting pan with water. We were going to turn this on overnight so that the next day we could complete a new canning project. We had some wonderful ham broth here, as well as the cooked meat that comes on those ham hocks. I decided I wanted to make a split pea soup base and can up a batch of that using this broth and meat, so I will go ahead and show you my process for doing that. I've got 7 quart jars here because that's what can fit in my Presto pressure canner, and then I've gathered my vegetables for the soup base. I'm going to start with onion. We're going to use the food processor to chop that up, and then we're going to distribute the contents of that food processor to our 7-quart jars, trying to divide it pretty evenly. And I would say that it turned out to be about the equivalent of 1 medium to large size onion went into each of these jars. This soup base is just going to contain all of the flavors that we like to go in our split pea soup, minus the actual split peas. So the next thing I like in split pea soup is garlic. I took 2 whole heads of garlic and we're splitting that in the jars. So each jar probably contains the equivalent of between 2 to 3 whole cloves of garlic. We like our food pretty garlicky, so that's a good amount for a batch of our split pea soup. Now, I like to add carrots to my split pea soup. Some people don't, but I think it adds a little bit of sweetness and some pretty color to the soup. So I'm just chopping up 1 to 2 carrots per jar. You could add whatever you want with most of these soup bases that I'm making. It's not going to affect the safety of the final product if you change up the vegetables. Add some celery. You could add regular peas, whatever you want to put in your split pea soup. Now we're going to do our seasonings, and I'm going to start with bay leaves. I love the flavor of bay leaf in a split pea soup. I'm doing 3 bay leaves per jar, and that is how many I would put in a big pot if I were making it fresh. And like I've mentioned before, change these spices up however you would like it, whatever you like to have in your split pea soup. Sometimes I like to add parsley, but I didn't want to run out to the garden, and I have these dried celery leaves that kind of give off a similar flavor that I really enjoy in the soup, and I wanted to use this jar up before I start using fresh parsley that I have from the garden. So I'm just adding these celery leaves. It's, I don't know, the equivalent of maybe a half a cup per jar, something like that. Now we're going to add our salt. I'm doing 1 tablespoon of salt per jar, and that's the extent of the flavorings that I'm going to add to my split pea soup. I could always add more later when I go to make it if I change my mind and decide I want to add something else. Now it's time to take all of the meat that has been cooling. I had pulled all of the ham hocks out of the roaster before I began this project so they would be cool enough for me to pick the meat off of the bones. And I'm just putting a little bit of meat per jar. Want to leave some headspace at the top. It's not a ton of meat, but meat isn't the star ingredient of a split pea soup. It's just there for a little bit of flavor and texture. You're going to get your protein from your split peas and your lentils. And then we're going to top these jars off with that wonderful ham broth that we made, and we want to leave 1-inch headspace in each of these jars. As always, you're going to want to debubble those jars. The bottom of them can be packed pretty tightly and can have air bubbles down there, and so as you stir them around, it's going to release that trapped air, and you're going to have to adjust your headspace. We're getting our lids on these jars. We're going to get the rings on. And then these are considered jars of soup per the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Quarts of soup need to be processed for 75 minutes in the pressure canner. So that is what we are doing. So you're probably wondering, where are the split peas? This is supposed to be split pea soup, right? But remember, this is just a base. That contained everything that if I were going to make a fresh pot of split pea soup and I were going to have to chop up my onions and my garlic and throw in all of the other seasonings, I just went ahead and put that in a quart jar so that it's ready. And then when I want to make a batch of split pea soup, all I'll do is the night before I will soak all of my split peas, and I usually add lentils, in some water. In the morning after breakfast, I'll drain all the water out of the split peas, throw them in a pot, and then I can just dump 1 of these quarts of the soup base in the pot, as well as any extra broth that I need to get it liquidy enough to simmer all day while we're doing school. Just a really easy lunch when I have those soup bases on hand. All right, another day, another project. I decided to work with tomatoes here. Adam had a coworker that gave him some extra tomatoes, and it was the perfect amount for me to work on a little batch of Sloppy Joe sauce. I've been wanting to do some, so that's what we're going to do. I started early in the morning and got my tomatoes simmering in a pot to kind of soften up and cook down a little bit. And once they were ready, I grabbed my immersion blender to just blend them all up together, skins and seeds and all. And with something like a sloppy Joe sauce, you really are going to need to cook this down. You want it to get super thick into a tomato sauce. So it took probably about 3.5 hours while we were going about our morning tasks. And this really cooked down. To help speed up the process, I added some freeze-dried green peppers. Those green peppers are going to absorb some of the liquid. So in lieu of using fresh peppers that you would usually add to your sloppy joes, I'm just going to use these freeze-dried ones. They need to be used up, and this is a great way to speed up the thickening process. So we're just going to add those, stir them in. They'll help absorb some of the liquid, but this is still going to need to cook down for several hours here. And I just have it on low, and every 20 minutes or so, I'm going to come in and stir the pot just to make sure nothing is scorching on the bottom of that. And you'll see that throughout the day, that liquid line is moving down on the pot. That means a lot of the water is evaporating and that sauce is getting nice and thick. Now, eventually, I'm going to grab my immersion blender again and blend those green peppers into the sauce once they're fully hydrated. I just want this to be nice and smooth. And once I had it to my desired thickness, I needed to pour it out so that I could measure it. The bulk canning recipe for sloppy Joe sauce, I'm going to link in the video description, but it only calls for 4 cups of tomato sauce per cup of vinegar that you're going to use. And it's going to be really important that I maintain that sauce to vinegar ratio so that my final product is going to be acidic enough to be safely water bath canned. So it was important that I measured out exactly how much sauce I had so that I knew how much vinegar I needed to add, as well as any of the other ingredients that I wanted. So I ended up with 16 cups of tomato sauce, which was perfect because 4 cups is the typical recipe. So I just knew I needed to quadruple all of the other ingredients. Now, the bulk canning recipe calls for tomato paste, but in lieu of using tomato paste, I decided to go ahead and use freeze-dried tomato powder. These were tomatoes from last year. Why use store-bought tomato paste in my canned product here when I could use up some of these homegrown tomatoes that need to be used anyways? And it will serve the same purpose as the tomato paste. The purpose of that paste is to thicken your sauce up even more, and this tomato powder is going to do the same thing. It's going to absorb more liquid. It's going to thicken up this sauce, get it exactly how we need it for our sloppy joes. So I'm just going to stir those in. The end result of all of this is going to be blended once again, so I'm not worried about any kind of chunks at this point. I just need that tomato powder to rehydrate. Now we're going to start adding the other ingredients, and once again you can find the exact recipe that I followed in the video description. Obviously I am quadrupling it, so we need to add our onion up and making sure to get every last bit of that out. I like to have a smooth sloppy Joe sauce. I don't want to have chunks of onion or green pepper in it. That's how my kids prefer it. So all of those chunks are eventually going to be blended in there. Adding our salt, and we're going to add our black pepper. It seems like a lot, but remember this is a quadruple batch. Now we're going to get that all stirred together, and the bowl recipe calls for Dijon mustard. I didn't have any in the house, but I do have this yellow mustard here. It's an organic mustard I ordered from Azure a while ago, and my daughter loves mustard, and she just did not love this kind. So it's been sitting in the back of the pantry shelves for a while, and I was very happy to find a project that I could kind of hide that mustard in. I know she doesn't like it as a condiment for dipping in things, but she's not going to notice it in the sloppy Joe sauce. It's just going to add our mustard flavor. So canning is a great way to hide some of those things that I need to get used up that I don't want to waste. Next thing we're going to do is add our vinegar. The recipe calls for store-bought apple cider vinegar that would be at 5% acidity. I only have homemade apple cider vinegar in the house that isn't at 5% acidity, so I'm going to use distilled white vinegar. It's not going to make a difference. It's also at a 5% acidity, so it's going to be just as safe as using the apple cider vinegar. It's just a slightly different flavor. but it's still giving you that vinegar taste that you are used to when you have a sloppy joe. And now we're going to add our sweetener. It called for brown sugar. I don't keep brown sugar in my house when I want brown sugar. I use white sugar and just add a little bit of blackstrap molasses. That gives you the same flavor that a brown sugar would have. So, all right, now we have all of our ingredients together here. I'm going to get it blended nicely so there aren't any chunks of anything left in there. And then this is going to cook down in the stove for just a little longer. That vinegar did make it a little more watery, and I want it to thicken up a little bit before I get it into jars. And now we're going to fill our jars. Now, when I want to make sloppy joes, I will need a quart of sauce. But unfortunately, this recipe doesn't have a canning time for quarts. It's only 4 pints. So I'm going to go ahead and can this in pint jars. And when I want to make sloppy joes, I will just grab 2 jars for my meat. It's not a big deal. I ended up with 12 pint jars, so that will make 6 meals for us. It's not a bad deal. When we want to make sloppy joes, all we'll have to do is brown up our meat, and then we can dump a couple jars of this sauce in there with it. I can make some homemade buns and a side dish. It's really nice. This is a much healthier version of a sloppy joe sauce than some of the name brand things like Manwich or whatever you could get in the store, and it's a great way to use up some of those homegrown ingredients that you want to get into jars. So as always, we really do need to wipe the rims of that. Having a clean rim is the key to success in avoiding seal failures with your lids. Another key to success is using the right lids, and I really do recommend these. These have the highest seal rate with the lowest failure rate out of any canning lids I have ever used. So we have 2 water baths going at the same time. Everything couldn't fit in one of them. And after 20 minutes in the water bath, our jars were sealed. Now you're going to notice that the solids sort of float to the top and some of the liquid is at the bottom. That is absolutely normal with the canning process and certain items. Once these jars cool and are sealed, you can shake it up and all of that liquid will get dispersed back into the jar, and it's not a big deal. If you see that separation of solids and liquids, it doesn't mean you messed up. That can be completely normal depending on the item that you're canning. So there you go. That's how I make my sloppy joe sauce. Our final project of the week, I had a child who had asked for strawberry jam for breakfast, and that is the one jam that I didn't make this year because during strawberry season I was so sick with this pregnancy with morning sickness that there was just no way that I could do any kind of canning. But I did have strawberries in the freezer, so I thought it was a good day to make some jam for that child. We have every other kind of jam on the shelves at this point. Blackberry, blueberry, so marmalades, tomato jam, cherry jam, all sorts of stuff, but no strawberry jam. So we're going to make a no pectin strawberry jam on this day. I just cooked down my strawberries, blended them up, added my sugar, and this is just going to cook down on the stove until it gets thick enough to gel naturally. No need to add pectin. And it was cooking all day long and it smelled amazing. It definitely drew a crowd. The kids wanted to stir for me. The smell of cooked strawberries is just delightful. So it is gonna take a lot longer than a jam or a jelly that you're going to make with pectin because you just need to evaporate enough water from that fruit in order to get the fruit thick enough. It's kind of like making an apple butter. When you make apple butter, you just cook the apples down until so much water evaporates that you have a thick butter texture. That's kind of what you're doing when you make something like a strawberry jam without a pectin. So we're going to fill our jars here, and fruits are also a high acid food. That means that they can go into the water bath canner instead of the pressure canner, and jams and jellies like this process for 10 minutes in the water bath. And remember, if you want to get 10% off canning lids, 4 Jars has great deals. They're often running sales, so check out the link in the video description. Now, when I put these in the water bath, because we have hard water, it can sometimes put a mineral film on my jars. So I always had a little distilled white vinegar to my pot that prevents any mineral buildup that could end up on the outside of my canning jars. And after 10 minutes, I had some very happy kids who finally have strawberry jam to add to the plethora of other flavors of jam and jelly that we have on the pantry shelves. All right, so that was it for this week. We will be back next week with the final video in this series. I can't believe how fast this month flew by, and I'm really feeling pressure in this final week to really get a lot accomplished, because once September hits, we're back to homeschool on September 3rd, and I will not have time for these canning projects unless I can squeeze them into the weekends. And so I have big plans for next week. We're going to do some more bulk preserving, mostly of tomatoes, because I am really behind on my tomato preservation this year. My harvest has not been wonderful from my own garden. So I'm probably going to need to purchase some bulk from a friend and get them in jars. And then at the end of next week, I'm going to get the cellar all organized and ready so that I can film everything that I was able to preserve during this growing season and show it to you in the first week of September. So, all right, my next task here is to get all of these labeled and get them downstairs, and we will be back next week. I hope you guys had a great week. Make sure you're checking out that hashtag Every Bit Counts Challenge. You can see all of the amazing content creators, food preservationists that are giving us wonderful ideas on how to get all of our food put up for the winter season. All right, friends, we'll see you next week. Bye.